301, Freedom Marshall, case for recovery, CV1 approach, expected final bearing 331, altimeter 3001, 170, 24 Angels, Niner. Expected approach time 33, approach button 17, time 18.
301, marshalling 170, 24 Angels, 9. Expected approach time 33, button.
Hello again everyone, and welcome back to the channel. In today's video we are going to be taking an early access look at the DC Designs AV-8B Harrier 2. The package actually comes with multiple variants of the aircraft, namely the AV-8B, the AV-8B Plus and the GR9. We're going to be focusing on the AV-8B here today, and for all intents and purposes the three variants that come with the package are broadly similar. It's really just aesthetic differences that you'll notice between the variants. Anyway, once again, Just Flight were kind enough to reach out to me asking whether or not I would like to preview the product. I'm a big fan of the Harrier personally and always enjoy a spot of VTOL flying, so I was more than happy to do so. Hopefully, as ever in today's video, I'll be able to give you a good feel for what the product is going to offer. Once again, this will be an early access look, so please do bear in mind that things could change between now and the product's release. Certainly there is still some work to be done on the jet at this stage in time. Nevertheless, I'll try and give you a detailed breakdown of the add-on, and hopefully in our video today, we're going to cover off most of what I think will be of interest to you with the Harrier. For our flight, we're currently on the deck of the USS America. As usual, initially we'll take a look at some of the modelling and texturing details of the aircraft. We're then going to carry out a full cold and dark start. We're currently stationed in the Persian Gulf, so we're going to be carrying out a short takeoff here off the deck of the USS America. We're going to be heading over to Bahrain to the Sakhir Air Base. We'll be carrying out some manoeuvres in the aircraft overhead the base. We'll then come in for a short field landing. We're going to be making a vertical takeoff out of the base and then returning back towards the USS America for a vertical landing back on the deck. Pretty good test there of the jet, I hope. And as with the DC Designs Concorde, my main interest here personally is to see how well the flight model holds up. Namely, of course, how the aircraft's going to behave in the vertical manoeuvres, the vertical takeoff and landing. Obviously, I don't have any real-world experience with the Harrier, but it is an aircraft I've enjoyed quite a bit in DCS. And whilst I'm sure that the DCS AV-8B still has its inaccuracies, we're going to really be using that as a bit of a benchmark for our test today. As always, please do bear in mind that DC Designs products are not intended to be study level, so set your expectations accordingly. With that being said though, I do hope you enjoyed the video. If you do, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. As ever, during the video, I'll try and give you a good look at the externals of the Harrier as we go. Nevertheless, we will just take the time here to get up close and personal with the model, just so that you can see some of the modelling and texturing in a little bit more detail. The AV-8B's external modelling and texturing very much up to a similar standard as previous DC Designs products. Of course, broadly the aircraft does look like the Harrier, and I have to say probably my favourite of the DC Designs aircraft thus far. Whilst there are certainly a few nice details, once again there are some areas that are a little bit rough in the modelling and the texturing. For example here, as you can see, we have the engine intake covers, which is a nice touch, but the modelling of those is slightly basic. And whilst hopefully I've demonstrated here that the aircraft certainly looks nice under particular lighting conditions, it can also have that slightly fiberglass effect when the light is coming across the bodywork at certain angles. It's nice as well that we do get the three variants of the aircraft. Again, you get the AV-8B, the AV-8B Plus and the Harrier GR9. Included with those variants is also a number of repaints, all of which are done to broadly the same standard. As you will no doubt already have noticed, the aircraft does come with the option to fit munitions. As always though, just be cautious there. If you do purchase the aircraft from the in-sim marketplace, then weapon loadouts won't be an option to you. As with other DC Designs products, to fit the weapons to the jet you just need to set an appropriate weight in the Sim's fuel and load menu. The Harrier comes with the option to fit both external drop tanks, AGM-65 missiles as well as AIM-9s. And lastly, you can also fit out the underslung gun pod. It is always nice to have these selectable munitions on these sorts of add-ons. It might have been nice in the case of the Harrier to have slightly more breadth in terms of weapon selection. The AV-8B and indeed the GR9 can carry quite a vast array of weapons, so it would have been nice to see a few more of those represented. Although of course the selection provided here by DC Designs does do the trick. Once again, the aircraft does make use of the default Asobo military pilot. Certainly no issues with that on my end. Again, the pilot model is very nice, very well animated. The only thing I would say there currently, as the pilot sits, his arm position, as you'll see later on, is a little bit askew, so hopefully that'll get fixed up. And you can see fairly low poly count there on the canopy arching. So undoubtedly there are still some areas of the jet that could use a little bit more finesse. And again, we're still looking at a pre-release version of the product here, so it may be that some of the modelling details still get a little bit of further refinement. I thought it was also worth briefly touching on why the Harrier versus the F-35. Of course, now we have the India Foxteco F-35 available in the sim. Both aircraft are VTOL capable and as a result can achieve much the same task. The Lightning, of course, though, very modern, a highly sophisticated and automated jet. The Harrier, as you'll see during our flight, is much more back to basics and I think therefore as a result much more fun to fly. Certainly the DCS version of the aircraft can be quite a challenge to fly well, and as a result it can be quite a rewarding experience. Whilst the DC Designs version of the aircraft is somewhat toned down in terms of difficulty to operate, you are probably still going to find it more of a handful than the F-35, and as we'll see later on, overall I do think that DC Designs have done a pretty nice job with the flight model. Internally, I do think that the Harrier is one of DC Design's better efforts in the sim to date. There are still certainly areas that could use some improvement, we'll touch on those in just a second's time. Modelling can still be a little bit rough in a few areas, but one of the aspects that I do like of the aircraft, there's definitely been a bit less artistic license taken with the Harrier. I always say with DC Design's products that you'll certainly know which aircraft you're looking at in terms of the cockpit, the same is certainly true here. But by and large with this product, most of the systems are laid out as you would expect to see them, and similarly, whilst not all functional by any means, the controls and switches do operate in the correct sense as you would expect. Here in the Harrier, by and large, the jet does operate as it should. One area that I do hope we see further improvements on over time, certainly the MFD functionality is a little bit limited as it stands. You get the option to display the HUD as we have here on the left, the option as well for an engine data page displayed here on the right. We also have a moving map display which you'll see throughout the flight. Other than that though, options are fairly limited, more so I would say than previous DC Designs products. Again though, do bear in mind this is an early access preview. But currently most of the pages are inoperative, and whilst this doesn't bother me too much, again we're not looking at a study level jet, it would be nice to see something like the stores page modelled at least in a loose sense. There is just a little bit of flickering as well I noticed there up on the ODU, which is at the top left. Again, hopefully that will be fixed up before release. Both the ODU and indeed the UFC functionality is again pretty limited versus the real world jet. We'll obviously be running through the aircraft systems once we get our flight underway, and again not a study level representation of the Harrier. Certainly one thing I think is very important to point out, all of the fundamental aspects of the Harrier, the systems that you'll need to operate the jet in both the short and the vertical takeoff and landing modes. So for example, the nozzle angle lever, the stow stop lever, the fuel dump switches, the water injection, the flap switch and so on. All of those systems work with enough capacity that you can operate the jump jet as intended. So with all of that in mind, we'll put my statement to the test, we'll start up our AV-8B and get the aircraft airborne. So we've now got our AV-8B back in a cold and dark state, here on the deck of the USS America. We're actually going to be using a DCS checklist for the startup here, primarily because I find the DC Designs checklist is a little bit simplistic. There are a few steps out of sequence as well. Using the DCS checklist here is going to allow us to fly the aircraft a little bit more accurately. Of course, so once again, we're not looking at a study level product, so you will notice some systems as we work our way through are inoperative. Anyway, running through the pre-start checks, the first item is for the canopy to be closed and locked, but we're actually going to leave the canopy open here, just so you can hear the startup sounds a little bit better. Next is the lift improvement device system. The switch there needs to be in the aft position. That's actually the normal position, currently it shows off in the model, but we'll leave the switch as is. Oxygen system is selected on. Stability augmentation system, we want the pitch, roll and yaw channels on. And for the Q fill there as well, the switch can go on. The rudder pedal shaker is set on, and the anti-skid switch is selected on. The startup procedure, the parking brake lever is set, battery master switch is on. According to the checklist here, we're looking for at least 24.5 volts on the battery, currently showing 0 there, so a little bit of work I think still needed on the electrical system. Generator switch can go on. Engine RPM switch is set to low. EFC is set to system 1. The left and right boost pumps are both selected on, and the fuel flow proportioner also selected on. The jet pipe temperature limiter switch again selected on, and the manual fuel switch is selected off. Throttle is fully aft. Nozzle position we'll set 10 degrees for now. That just directs the engine nozzles down slightly, avoids damaging both the flaps and the tailplane. So throttle is set, nozzle position is set, fuel shut-off handle Interestingly here, in the real-world aircraft I believe down is on. We'll select down for now, but in actuality it seems to be that currently in the model up is on in the DC Designs version of the Harrier. Anyway, lastly the digital engine control system is selected on. We'll start off the APU, so we'll select that on as well. That should run up. No sounds currently associated with the APU, which is a little bit of a shame, but they may well make their way onto the aircraft before release. So APU now running. We'll select the engine starter. And we'll monitor the engine here as it spools up. You can see the RPM coming up. So we'll just wait until we see max motoring. As I say, currently with the fuel lever being in the reverse sense, we're going to have to head back and select that up. So you can see we have max motoring around 25% there on the RPM, and the engine not lighting off. Again, if we select the fuel lever up, you can see we now have a good light off, showing fuel flow, jet pipe temperature coming up. And I'll just keep quiet now so you can hear the engine spooling up. Okay, so we do have a good start. The engine idling there around 61%. Jet pipe temperature around 285 degrees. The starter does cut out automatically. I believe the APU should as well, but we'll select that off. So RPM should stabilise between 28.4 and 29%. You can see we're a little bit high there. Jet pipe temperature didn't exceed 545. For the hydraulics, we're looking for at least 3000 psi on both sides. We are a little bit low, currently showing about 2,600. We have a plus or minus 200 tolerance, so that should be slightly higher. Nozzle position, once again we do have selected to 10 degrees, actually 16 degrees presently. Next, for the startup procedures, the seat ground safety lever should be down, but that's not currently modelled on the aircraft. Flap switch should be in the middle position here. That's actually one of the few switches not modelled. For the flap mode switch, we ideally want to go to cruise, but currently again not modelled. We only have auto or stall position, so we'll leave the flaps in auto for now. For the RWR and the various avionics systems, we're going to skip through those today. Obviously they're not relevant to our flight. INS similarly not really modelled. We can actually activate the switch, so we'll move it into nav, but again not effectively modelled on the aircraft. So we'll say that the INS has been aligned. The after start checks, the altimeter switch can go to radar altimeter. Radios are set. HUD display brightness we'll leave as is. The HUD is pretty decent in these sort of lighting conditions, but it does tend to get a little bit washed out in bright lighting conditions. It'd be nice to be able to turn that up a little bit more. Anyway, the HUD is set, same for the video brightness. Again, there are a few switches out of place, so currently it looks like the FLIR switch is down here. I believe in reality it's actually just out to the left. But again, we'll leave the FLIR, the DMT and the probe heat in their current positions for the flight today, as they're not really relevant. Anyway, that's the startup complete. We'll just close up the canopy and we'll make our way onto the deck.
301, read back correct, block 7144.
7144.
300, Marshall 170, 25 Angels 10. Expected approach time 34, approach button 15.
300 Marshall 17025 Angels 10, push time 34, button 15.
300, read back correct, clock 7145.
Marshall 207.
Okay, so we're now lined up on the deck. We're going to be carrying out a short takeoff for our first run. We're just below £20,000 currently, so we could actually carry out a vertical takeoff, but we're going to do that out of Sakhir Air Force Base. So first things first, the VTOL master switch there is selected on. The stow stop lever, ordinarily we would set that for the takeoff position of the nozzles, but today we're just going to leave that fully aft. It's a little bit fiddly to use in the sim. For the takeoff today we're going to be using a nozzle angle of 60 degrees. The nozzle position currently set to 16 degrees. Flaps lever will go to stall. HJ water injection not required, so we'll leave the switch off. Stabilizer trim is set. Anti-skid switch is on. Part brake can come off. So we're going to hold the aircraft on the brakes. We'll come up to takeoff power, and then towards the end of the deck here we'll go into the 60-degree nozzle angle, lifting ourselves off the deck. One slight issue with the aircraft currently, it doesn't hold very well on the brakes, so you'll see we creep forward pretty soon after we come up on the power, which does somewhat extend the takeoff run. Anyway, coming forward on the throttle. You can see now creeping forward on the brakes, so off the brakes. And power is set. Coming up on the nozzles. And lifting off. So overall everything working pretty nicely there, as you can see. The gear can come up. Through 120 knots, we'll start reducing our nozzle angle, and we'll come on a heading of 223 inbound towards Sakhir. So flaps can go back to auto, and again just continuing to reduce that nozzle angle back towards forward flight. And we'll just come back slightly on the throttle as well now. But we'll continue with a fairly high power setting here as we're going to continue our climb. We'll pitch for a climb here of around 300 knots. So overall the aircraft actually handles very nicely in the short takeoff configuration, as you saw. There are just a couple of features missing, particularly in terms of avionics. There's no ability to calculate any of the takeoff performance data. So for example, the nozzle angle and the rotate speed, although I believe that's not relevant on a carrier operation, but of course in the DCS version of the aircraft you can actually calculate both of those, whereas in the Microsoft Flight Simulator version here you don't have the opportunity to do so. Nevertheless, what we're really concerned about here is the handling characteristics, and so far, as I said, the aircraft operates pretty nicely. I have noticed you do get a few flight model peculiarities transitioning through various stages on occasion. So for example, going from the short takeoff configuration into forward flight, occasionally the aircraft gets a little bit jumpy. The same is true when going into the hover. Come back into barometric altitude for the time being on the HUD. And we'll leave ourselves in V-stall here. It's a pretty short section over towards Sakhir. We'll be coming in for a short landing and then a vertical takeoff later on, as I said. Anyway, for now we'll just continue here in the cruise over towards the Sakhir Air Force Base. Once we're over the base we're going to carry out some manoeuvring just to test out the flight model a little bit more, and then, as I say, we'll make our short field landing. Once we're back on the ground we'll carry out our vertical takeoff, and then we'll be heading back towards the carrier.
Roger, 10 over 3. 612, Courage departure radio check.
612, optional.
612, heavy lab clear. 99, BRC 280, altimeter 3003. 99, Mother Steady, BRC 278.
601, airborne.
601, Courage departure, radar contact.
Okay, so we're just approaching the Sakhir Air Force Base. You can see the airfield there just coming up off the nose. You should as well be able to make out the Formula 1 circuit just out towards the west. As I say, first things first, we'll just put the aircraft through a few manoeuvres here just to get a feel for the flight model in a bit more depth. Then we'll be coming back in on the northerly runway for our short field landing. We'll clear the runway and then we'll depart once again in a vertical takeoff back towards the carrier. So we'll just come overhead the racetrack first of all, I think, take a look at that, then we'll line ourselves up back with the northerly runway, go through a loop. I'm sure a few of you are big Formula 1 fans, I certainly am. So we'll pull a little bit of G here as we come overhead the track. We'll actually come back into nav on the HUD here just so we can see our G-force as we go, pulling about 3 Gs at the moment. And downwind now for the runway. As I say, we'll line ourselves up with the runway, use that as a bit of a reference for our manoeuvre, or manoeuvres. So 350 knots. I have noticed, I think the aircraft is slightly underpowered in the cruise power range. For about 350 knots, you need about 94% on the RPM, whereas it seems to be around 85% in the DCS version of the aircraft. In terms of the takeoff power range, though, it seems pretty reasonable. You do need pretty high power settings with the vertical takeoff, which again seem broadly familiar with the DCS power settings for a vertical takeoff manoeuvre. Just duck down here a little bit early just to avoid that bank of cloud. Come back up to 100% on the RPM. Now making our way back in towards the runway. So we'll build up some speed. Low altitude warning, we'll disregard for now. And flying ourselves down the runway low level. Overall, again, the aircraft feels pretty nice in terms of how it handles thus far. And back on the stick. Reasonably heavy on the controls. In quite a lot of backstick here to get the nose up. Pulling around 3G in the loop. Speed bleeding off quite nicely. We should have some nice vapour effects there. Okay, we're not pulling quite enough G at the moment to get the vapour effects, but we'll take care of that soon enough. About 250 knots here as we come over the top of the loop. And we'll just roll out here. Back onto the reciprocal heading. Yeah, so as I say, I quite like how the aircraft handles overall. There are, as we discussed on the departure off the USS America, there are a few areas of the flight model which get a little bit twitchy during what I presume is transitions between various flight model phases, but overall the aircraft handles quite nicely in the various phases, so it handles pretty well on the vertical takeoff. Same was true on the short takeoff, and indeed in the what is effectively the cruise portion of the flight here, it handles pretty well. We'll start pulling a bit more G now, fully back on the stick, up to around 5G. You can see now we do have those rather nice vapour effects coming off the wings. I noticed that the roll rate on the aircraft seems to be a little bit slower than the DCS version. That's full deflection out to the left, slightly slow roll rate there. Again, I don't know how that stacks up versus the real world jet. Just going to build up a little bit more speed here again. We'll go for another hard turn here just to demonstrate that the aircraft does take a little bit of time initially to bleed off speed under G. So we'll just get ourselves back up to around 400 knots. There's our speed, so we'll brake out to the left, fully back on the stick. And you can see actually maintaining the speed. Still doing 410 here. Just going to have to ease off the controls there to avoid blacking out. But you can certainly hold the speed for quite some time before it starts to bleed off. You can see if we maintain the turn there, we do start to bleed off that energy eventually. Just a slight twitch there from the flight model. So we're doing about 98% on the RPM, maintaining around 370 knots here, although we are in a bit of a descent currently. Okay, so more or less level flight now, and indeed the speed falling off. Max deflection out back at around 330 knots. I think the aircraft is maybe just in some phases lacking a little bit of response on the controls, but again, good fun to fly, very easy to throw around. And I wouldn't say it's a million miles removed from how the DCS version of the aircraft felt to fly. You do have quite an abundance of power in the Harrier, so it is good fun to throw around. Nice high thrust to weight ratio, for obvious reasons. So again, I quite like the flight modelling overall. As I always have to caveat with that statement, not necessarily study level, but nevertheless, I think for Jet and Microsoft Flight Simulator it's pretty good. Anyway, we're on a bit of a crosswind here, so we'll just join onto a crosswind in for a left-hand downwind. As I say, we're going to go for the short field landing here. We'll just hold around 350 knots for now. We'll come back into radar altimeter on the HUD and back into VTOL. Coming overhead the runway, back around towards the racetrack. Off the throttle, again we'll pull some G, just to help bleed off that speed. And as we do so, we can start increasing that nozzle angle back up to around 60 degrees. Speed's looking good, the gear can come down. We'll set the flaps back to auto. Doing around 160 knots currently, on a pretty nice downwind position. Then we now have gear down, all greens, flap indication looks good, and again the aircraft flying very nicely, hands off currently, trimmed out, maintaining around 140 knots. I'll take a fairly nice long downwind here just to give me plenty of time to figure out our power setting here. Slightly unusual in the Harrier of course for the short field landing. We're basically relying on some of our thrust component here to keep us airborne vertically with that 60-degree down nozzle angle. So we're going to be adjusting our power quite a bit here to adjust our rate of descent. And indeed during the landing, instead of flaring the aircraft, we're more or less just going to be chopping the power. I believe that's more or less the correct technique. So coming back round towards the north, lining ourselves up with runway 35. A little bit fast here currently, but we've got plenty of time to bleed off the speed. Just put our flight path vector here on the touchdown zone. Again, a little bit of a jump in the flight model there. It's wanting to push the nose up. And seems as though we've got a bit of a crosswind here. The wind is around 10 knots, so I think that's still within limits to carry out a conventional short field landing. You can see sure enough there looking at the windsock, quite a crosswind out from the left. So just starting to come back on the throttle. There's touchdown, a little bit of a bump, but most Harrier landings I've seen are a little bit bumpy, so I'll let myself off on that one. Just keeping the aircraft straight with rudder, coming all the way through on the engine nozzles, and letting the aircraft slow down. We'll taxi off the runway here in towards the apron. We'll carry out our vertical takeoff from the apron itself. Right, so we're back on the deck, this time on the apron with the aircraft pointed into wind, and as I say, we're going to be carrying out our vertical takeoff manoeuvre. One thing that is worth noting with the Harrier, for those that aren't familiar with the aircraft, you can't necessarily vertically take off or land in any configuration. It is very weight dependent. Ideally you want to be below around £20,000 if you're going to carry out either a vertical takeoff or landing. So running through our vertical takeoff checks, the stow stop lever is selected fully aft. Nozzle position can go through to 82 degrees. 82 degrees seems to be the real world position, but the DC Designs version of the aircraft seems to be quite happy around 90 degrees as well, so we'll go for somewhere in the middle, we'll go for 87 degrees. Flaps lever is selected to the stall position. H2O water injection, again at our current weight, not required today. Stabilizer trim is set, anti-skid is selected on, park brake is off. So we'll just hold the aircraft on the brakes. And gradually coming up on the throttle, obviously until we see the jet lift off. With these trees in front of us here, we are going to have to manoeuvre a little bit on the departure, but I thought that would be interesting, just so, again, we can get a bit more of a feel for the AV-8B's handling. Coming up on around 90% on the RPM, and definitely, as you can see, the aircraft getting quite light now on the wheels. Just checking back a little bit on the stick here to make sure we don't head straight off into the trees. Yeah, there's 96%. And up to around 98, 99 as it's airborne. I think the aircraft handles quite nicely overall in the hover. Definitely a little bit easier than the DCS version of the Harrier. Much more stable, doesn't need as much correction. But obviously that's a little bit of a concession to make the aircraft more enjoyable and accessible to a large number of people. We'll take the gear up. And once again we'll just slowly start reducing that nozzle angle, transitioning into forward flight. Just making sure we keep a positive rate of climb. We'll head back out towards the Sakhir circuit. And relatively low RPM here, so keeping our jet pipe temperature nice and low as well, not really too concerned there. That can be a bit of an issue in the Harrier. Okay, just pitching up again, making sure we don't descend. Picking up a little bit of speed now, up to around 70 knots. As we transition to forward flight, obviously the wing's creating more lift, so we can start reducing that nozzle angle further, as we're not so reliant on the thrust to keep us airborne. Back to 75 degrees now on the nozzle angle. Just coming up on 100 knots. As I said, the aircraft manoeuvres quite nicely at this sort of speed and this sort of configuration. Again, a little bit of a jump in the flight model there, quite noticeable. Presumably now we're transitioning into the forward flight stage of the flight model in the sim, as we pick up speed. Up to 120 knots now, we'll just keep the flaps until we've got the nozzle angle a little bit lower. Okay, 25 degrees on the nozzle angle, we'll take the flaps back to auto. And the nozzle's now coming all the way back to the fully aft position, so again, in the normal forward flight configuration. Keep the power as is for now, we'll just come back overhead the Sakhir Air Base. and then we're looking for a heading of 043 back towards the carrier. We'll make our way back home again around 360 knots, so coming back to around 94% for the RPM. I've noticed as well there does seem to be a little bit more lag on the throttle input versus the engine output, again compared with the DCS version of the aircraft. And just to be clear, none of these are criticisms of the product per se, it's just an observation. Again, I'm not expecting the same standards from the two products. And I think in terms of the flight model and general modelling of the aircraft outside of the visuals and at the moment as well the avionics, I think what DC Designs has managed to achieve here with the Harrier is actually very well done. Again, good fun, feels pretty plausible. Come back to barrel on the altimeter once again, and we'll go back into nav on the HUD. So on to heading of 043. It's about 45 miles to run out towards the USS America once again. Looking good in terms of our power setting. Fuel flow around 118. I believe that's in pounds per minute, which is probably about right. Again, we're a slightly higher power setting than would be typical in the DCS Harrier for this sort of speed. And fuel state down to around 2,600 pounds now. They've got about 20 minutes of fuel on board very roughly. Bingo fuel, as you can see, 1,400 pounds. We should arrive back to the USS America with just enough fuel to make our approach and vertical landing back onto the deck.
99 K3 recovery, CP1 approach, expected final bearing 331. Mother's weather, a few at 1,000, few at 12,000, ceiling at 20,000, broken, visibility 7, altimeter 3001. Blue water ops, tank as follows. Rhino tank 4.1, Hornet tank 3.5, Prowler tank 4.6, standby for Primac. 99 time and 48 seconds, 26. 402, Roger, Eagle Center, time and 30 seconds, 26.
Alright, so we're just coming back in towards the USS America. We'll peel off to the right here, and then head back towards the carrier for a left-hand brake to join back onto the deck. We've come back into radar altimeter there on the HUD, and also back into VTOL. In terms of our fuel state, 2,100 pounds now, so again we should be back on the deck just above bingo fuel. I happen to know that there's a helicopter out to the right of the carrier, so we'll come straight overhead the deck for our brake. Trying to avoid pulling too much G here just so we don't bleed off too much of that speed. 350 knots is about right. Okay, so good on the speed, looking pretty good there on the altitude as well. You can see the helicopter there just off on the right. And over the deck, so peeling off to the left. Going back on the power. And we just want to start increasing that nozzle angle again back up to 60 degrees. Just keeping a little bit of power on here to avoid sending the jet too soon. We're probably a little bit wide here for a downwind, but nevertheless will give us plenty of time to get set up for the approach. Speed is checked, we'll take the gear down. And flaps can come back to the stall position. So we'll start turning in towards the carrier. Cheating a little bit here with the level segment. Now that we're in the turn, really having to come up on the power to avoid that high descent rate. Come up to 70 degrees now on the nozzle angle, just to start bleeding off some of that forward speed. And again, the flight model is just a little bit jumpy at times. There's 80 degrees now on the nozzle. 4 greens on the gear. Fuel state 1,900 pounds. And again, just feeding in some power to avoid a high descent rate, speed coming back towards 100 knots. Bearing in mind as well, we've got about 10 degrees of headwind off the nose currently. There's 90 on our nozzle angle. Get ourselves lined up here parallel with the deck, and then we'll just kill off the forward speed, match the speed of the carrier. Just reducing our nozzle angle again slightly, just to bring us slightly further forward. We'll aim to land at the second set of markings here, just off at our 1 o'clock. So again, the aircraft is quite a bit easier to manoeuvre in the vertical configuration versus the DCS Harrier, but that's to be expected. That's what DC designs are going for. Still a nice challenge without a doubt, but for the most part actually fairly stable here, and you can just put in your control inputs to manoeuvre as desired. You don't necessarily have to juggle the controls quite as much as you would with the DCS AV-8B. So just edging ourselves right onto the deck, and slightly off the power here to get us into a descent. And touchdown. So chopping the power onto the brakes. We landed with 1,500 pounds, so just above bingo fuel there. We'll get ourselves off the deck and go and get the aircraft shut down. So just clearing the main area of the deck, we'll get ourselves swung back round. Onto the brakes, park brake can go on. Running through the after landing and securing checks, the park brake is set, landing light is off, flaps go back to auto. According to the checklist they need to go up. The left boost pump and right boost pump switches can go off. And worth noting now I'm using the DC Designs checklist just for the shutdown. So boost pumps are off, fuel proportioner switch is off, and the fuel valve is selected closed. Good run down there on the engine. Anti-collision light can go off. We'll open up the canopy. And we can get the generator and the battery off. So a good shutdown there on the jet, and I have to say, overall, a really fun outing in the aircraft. So there you go guys, I do hope you enjoyed our outing in the DC Designs Harrier. Once again, this is an early access preview of the aircraft as opposed to a full review, and please bear in mind as a result things may change between now and release. Nevertheless, so we'll just briefly run over what I think of the product, what I've liked and what I've not liked in our flight today. As I think I mentioned during our flight, overall for me this is my favourite DC Designs product released to date without a doubt. As I mentioned with DC Designs Concorde, really what I'm looking for is a product where the jet can actually perform the unique functions of the Harrier. And in that regard, as you've hopefully seen in the video today, overall I would give the product a thumbs up. The flight model is definitely where the aircraft shines. Again, not necessarily study level, but it does get most of the fundamentals right. You can perform a fairly convincing vertical takeoff, vertical landing, short field takeoff and short field landing. And in terms of the manoeuvring as well, the jet broadly felt the part. Certainly the DC Designs Harrier is much easier to fly in the hover than the DCS Harrier. The aircraft is much more stable. Once again though, DC Designs are aiming to offer up a fairly accessible product here, and nevertheless, the aircraft does still provide quite a nice challenge, as I say. There was, as we've discussed already, a few issues switching between the various phases of flight. Occasionally the flight model can behave a little bit strangely there, even to the point on occasion where it can be quite difficult to control the jet. Nevertheless though, I believe in reality the Harrier does have to be flown in quite a prescribed way, and once you get used to the DC Designs version of the aircraft, you can work around the couple of issues that do exist. So the flight modelling for me, given the product's target audience and also the level of complexity that must come with modelling the vertical takeoff and landing, again overall I would give it a thumbs up. I very much enjoyed flying the aircraft. In terms of the aircraft systems, once more it was nice to see a little bit more accuracy there than some of the previous DC Designs products. Almost every physical switch in the cockpit does operate, although quite a few of them don't have anything going on behind the scenes. But I did appreciate the fact that the switches that were modelled were generally modelled appropriately for their system. And again, I will stress that most of the systems unique to the Harrier that really are important for flying the jet as intended, they are all modelled. A few concessions here and there, as we saw with the flap switch, no cruise mode for example, but again it was perfectly possible to take off and land vertically using the real-world aircraft controls as intended by and large. One systems area where I certainly would like to see improvements comes with the avionics. Most of the MFD functionality is of course not really relevant in the sim and not really appropriate for this level of product. But again, it would have been nice to have the stores page, perhaps as well a basic VRES page so that we can calculate takeoff speeds and nozzle angles. Just slightly enhanced MFD functionalities to firstly make the aircraft feel like a fighter jet, and again just have some of the functionalities unique to the Harrier. Modelling and texturing I think we've discussed throughout. Again, the aircraft does broadly look accurate in terms of the modelling, both internally and externally. Also there are of course a few low poly areas throughout the aircraft. I did like the fact though that the cockpit was somewhat more authentically modelled this time versus the real world counterpart. And texturing much the same. Again, under certain lighting conditions I think the Harrier looks pretty nice, but there are some rough areas in terms of texturing. In terms of the aircraft sounds, overall I thought they were actually pretty excellent. Hard to say whether or not the sounds are accurate versus the real world jet, but certainly as again compared with the DCS version of the aircraft, the DC Designs Harrier had that really nice whine to the engine. And both internally and externally I thought the aircraft sounds were convincing. A really nice roar as well from that Pegasus engine, particularly at high power settings. It is quite a unique sound that the Harrier has, and again I think DC Designs have done a pretty nice job replicating that overall. As it stands, the jet is a little bit FPS hungry. I was getting around 70 FPS versus about 106 in the default Cessna 152. So dropping about 36 frames overall, which certainly wasn't unbearable, but do bear that in mind. And of course your results, as always, will vary depending on your system configuration. I liked the aircraft effects as well. The vapour coming off the wings at high G was great. The exhaust effects out of the nozzles was good as well. You may have noticed during the video they weren't always aligned. I believe that's an issue with my recording tool. It perhaps would have been nice as well to see some dust and particle effects during the takeoff and the landing, but once more perhaps those will be added before release. In short, looking at the product in its current state, there are still certainly areas that can be improved, and again we are looking at an early access version of the aircraft. A few issues that do still need cleaning up. As I mentioned at the start of the video though, for me at least what I thought was important is that the DC Designs Harrier gets the fundamentals of a VTOL aircraft correct. By and large that certainly seems to be the case, and as a result I do think the Harrier has its own unique place in the sim. Really good fun to fly, a nice challenge above and beyond the F-35, a fairly unique offering in the sim currently, and one that I really hope we'll see continue to go from strength to strength. Although the DC Designs Harrier doesn't look to be a study level rendition of the aircraft, I think the fundamentals are there, and if you are a fan of the jump jet, then you are probably going to enjoy this product overall. Anyway, hopefully the video has given you more of a feel for what the product has to offer. As I say, the DC Designs Harrier should be releasing fairly soon, initially exclusively through Just Flight, and then I believe later on as well it will be made available through the in-sim marketplace. Once again ladies and gents, if you did enjoy the video then please consider giving it a like. If you want to see more content from the channel then please consider subscribing as well. Another thank you to Just Flight for letting us take an early access look at the product. And as always, a very big thank you to my channel members and patrons for all of your support. I do hope that all of you are having a great day wherever you are. Take really good care, and I will see you all again soon.